How's everyone doing today? Welcome to the Professional Development Edge podcast. I'm Jon Forster. I got a great guest here today. We got Aree Bly. Aree is the founder of Alignment Ally, as well as the author of the great book, The Sustainable Brain. How you doing today, Aree?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here. How are you?
Yeah, we're excited to have you. I know you just filmed some great content for Professional Development Edge Plus video series coming out about working with ambiguity, which is what we're going to touch on. If you're watching and you don't know about PDEdge Plus, that's our learning platform from the SOA that is a subscription service where you can get tons of great short form videos like Aree's, as well as comprehensive courses and recordings from all of our major meetings, as well as live webcast and recordings of the webcast. So it's a great platform to get your professional development needs around whatever topic you're interested in actuarial. So Aree, glad that we have you here. Let's start off and talk about ambiguity and why you feel that developing this comfort with ambiguity is extremely important for actuaries as well as other professionals.
Yeah, well, first of all, we are trained when we're going through exams to have a right answer to eliminate ambiguity, and we're given problems that don't have a lot of ambiguity. And so we aren't well adapted to dealing with ambiguity from the beginning. But if you look at the situations that we're working in, more and more, we operate in gray areas with our clients, gray areas with the regulation, with the technology that's changing. There's a lot of ambiguity out there. And if we don't become good at dealing with it, at navigating, at continuing to move forward through it, we are going to get left behind as a career and as individuals within our career.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And you talked about a lot of the areas where there is ambiguity. There's ambiguity with data, there's ambiguity with models, ambiguity with regulations, ambiguity with just talking to peers and other folks around the company. So could you give us an example of where dealing with ambiguity happened to you in practice, and how did that affect the business outcome?
Yeah, well, one of the first places I found it was in the data. I worked for a large organization that had some international work, and we discovered there were some data anomalies. And when we looked into them, what it was the dates for some of the data, the claims data, I was in healthcare at the time, were in some instances, they were put in as day, month, year, other instances as month, day, year. So one is much more common in the US. Another format is more common in outside of the US. So what happened, I don't know, on the IT side, why this wasn't kind of captured and created, but we had these data issues where we're like, okay, that's not a correct date. We need to understand, what the actual date is. Now, why that becomes important is we were doing IBNR analyses. We were looking at how quickly claims were paid out. So if we had a date of 12/4, whatever the year was, and we didn't know if it was an April 12th or a December 4th date, our analysis would come up with fairly different numbers. So what we did was we said, okay, well, what if we exclude the data that doesn't fit? What if we assume one truth, another truth, and we try and figure out what the variability is, like what kind of range of impact are we talking about? And then we talked about how much conservatism we wanted to have in here. So it was being a little bit more pragmatic once we could quantify what that ambiguity was creating for us in the data. So that was one really concrete example of, okay, we don't always have good data. We have to make some calls about what data to use and how to interpret what we have.
Yeah, and definitely big difference there if a claim's incurred in April versus December of the year, to make sure that you have you're able to deal with that. One thing you talked about, you said actuaries are used to a right and wrong answer in the exams. We're used to being precise. But you do talk about in some of your videos about knowing when things are good enough, and how would you advise folks to understand when things are good enough without lowering the quality of their work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's understanding the purpose of the work that you're doing. Like, what is this going to be used for? And given where it's going to be going, does it have to be 4 decimal places accurate, or can it be, something less accurate than that, but gives the right information for the person that's going to be using it? So that's the first piece, is really to understand the downstream direction of your work. And that will help you make the right call for how much precision do we need. And the second piece of this is really understanding, okay, whether it is time constraints or budget constraints, we may have to do some adjustment or I guess, holding back on our ability to analyze to the nth degree and use the 80-20 rule, or allow ourselves to get the A- or the B+ on the results when more money or more time may have given us an opportunity to get further. A B+ is often a good enough answer to get the work done for decision makers to make their decisions for the business, for the clients, and we don't have to give them the most precise answer.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And a lot of times there's diminishing returns there where the workload to get from a B plus to an A minus is much greater than to get from a C to a B plus. And just understanding that capacity is very, very good to know. So let's talk about another thing that you said. You said 40% of project failures, come from ambiguity, not just the technical errors. So how are ways that you could make sure that everybody is on the same page from the beginning and understand the scope of a project from the beginning? Why don't you talk through some of that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to communication. I know I am guilty of, as soon as you give me data, I'm jumping in. I'm like, I want to know what the data is. I want to summarize it. I want to understand it, and then I want to kind of do something with it. But whether you're in consulting, which is where I spent probably the bulk of my time, but even in corporate situations, we need to understand kind of what our stakeholders are needing from us. So we need to ask a lot of questions, and we need to set some expectations with them. We need to know, like I said earlier, what's the purpose of the work? Where is this going to be going? But what absolutely has to be included in here? So what are the must-haves for the deliverables, for the analysis, for the angle that we look at this data, for the answers that they're looking for? What are the critical questions? And on the other end of that spectrum, what is excluded? I know, a lot of us love to follow what's interesting. We're digging into the data and we're like, "Ooh, that's curious. Let me see what's going on there." And all of a sudden we've spent days going down a rabbit hole. We need to spend time deciding what's out of scope. Like, what are we not going to do? And then in the middle, you've got kind of your should haves and could haves. That's where you get the flexibility to accommodate changing requirements, or, higher or lower time constraints that you may run into. So spending time to scope out the expectations of the stakeholders, as well as then being very clear with the stakeholders and with your teams, what do we have to be doing? What will we not be doing? And where do we have the flexibility in the middle?
Yeah, 100%. I think the one thing you pointed to, making sure that you're saying this is out of scope, that's something that setting those boundaries from the get-go is very key, so people don't go spending their time down a rabbit hole that could detract from the purpose of the project. Another technique you mentioned is the RACI framework, and that's something that I use often in my career in working with various teams, and I think it's a very good framework for people to know. So why don't you explain a little bit about that framework and how it could be leveraged to help actuaries do their job better?
Yeah, so the RACI framework is one where it's really about kind of combining the communication with the accountability and figuring out, okay, when we're working with teams, which we almost always are, even if we're the one doing all the work, our stakeholders are part of that team, right? So RACI, R-A-C-I, is a way of identifying some of the key roles and responsibilities in the team. So the R is responsible. That's the person or the people who are doing the task. Who's responsible for building the model? Who's responsible for cleaning the data? Who's responsible for writing the report? Those people need to know that that is their responsibility. What comes with that is also what decisions are they responsible for making? There's decisions at every level, and we need to be making sure that people know what they're responsible for in terms of even making decisions. The A is accountable. So who is ultimately accountable for making sure that this is correct, that it's going out timely, that what we promised in the deliverable, whether it's to an internal stakeholder or to a client, is what they're getting. So this person's often the one who is delegating work, managing the project, giving final sign off to make sure that everything is as expected. The C is people who are going to just be consulted. So they're the ones whose opinions matter. They may have some influence or some interest in the project. You're going back and forth with them to get their feedback, but they may not be the ultimate decision makers. They are not necessarily responsible for it, but they've got some perspective or some insights that they want to complete or add in. And then I is people who just need to be informed. So they need to be kept up to date on the progress. They might need just to know whether we're on track or not. They may need to know what decisions are being made, but they're not really directly involved. So it's about communicating with them, mostly in one direction, communication for them just to keep them up to date. Now, the reason that this is really important is a lot of times if you don't spend the time kind of making sure everyone's clear on who's making decisions, who's responsible for what, who's accountable for what, you get to the end of the project, something goes wrong, and there's a lot of finger pointing, right? It's like, oh, wait, I thought you were making that decision. I wasn't going to look at that. Nobody looked at something and it fell through the cracks. So it really helps to make sure that everything is accounted for and that people can take ownership of their piece of the project.
Yeah, like I said, I always appreciated that when it's defined up front. It gives people their the ability to say, wait, I want to be at this level or that level. You don't need me to make the decision. I just need to be in the loop. Or this is something that I should be on a different tier of that RACI framework. So it's definitely very good from both sides, one for whoever's running the project to set expectations, and then other folks to then do that up front to say where they should fall on that. So that's definitely a great framework there. So let's also talk about, ambiguity could come from a lot of different places. And sometimes there's ambiguity that you don't have a lot of control over. It could happen from company dynamics, could be a merger, could be changes in leadership, could be reshuffling of responsibilities. How do people deal with those types of ambiguity, especially people that are at that mid-level part of their career? So how do you deal with that to make sure that
Yeah, it's pretty hard because that's stuff that we don't have control over, right? We are going to have to respond to those decisions, those changes, but we don't have a lot of control over it. So that's what makes it almost more terrifying. So we fall into fight or flight, right? So sometimes we just try and ignore it. Sometimes we try and control it, even though we can't. But the best way that we can deal with it, especially for those mid levels, is ask questions, right? Get curious about what you can find out about it, who's making decisions, when might something like this happen? Like what time frame are you working under? Like, is there something that you can learn or just know who to watch, that's going to make these decisions? But beyond getting, a little bit of clarity and at least paying attention, shorten the time frame of your own team's focus, right? So if you've got some ideas for what you want to be doing, a year from now and what you want to accomplish in the next year, but there's a little bit of ambiguity around, okay, are we going to have a merger? There's some, rumors floating around and I don't know how real they are and they would really impact our ability to do this project. Or, regulations are going to be changing. There's a new administration and I don't know what's going to be happening with this market, start shortening your time frame for the projects and the focus and the strategy that you're working on. So if that means working mostly in 90-day windows, that's fine. You know, you're not going to have the view to anything beyond that. So use the appropriate time frame, and then pay attention to some of those leading indicators. Like, know what to watch for that may indicate, okay, this might, you know, something's shifting. We may be able to know a little bit more about that. The regulators put out a draft policy. Let's look at that and get some idea of what might be happening so that you have a little bit more information.
Yeah, definitely great info there. And let's finalize it where your broader purpose is helping people maintain a sustainable career. So could you talk a little bit about having these tools, working with ambiguity, how that's going to help folks kind of maintain their career and more importantly, their personal well-being?
Yeah, and sustainability is something that can get impacted significantly by all this ambiguity that's out there, right? When we don't know, you know, what's happening in the market or in our company or within our team, or we don't feel like we have a lot of control, we can kind of spiral to the point where we're like, okay, I don't know what's going on in my own career. But really, what happens with ambiguity that impacts the sustainability of your career and your wellness is kind of some of that stress, some of that trying to control things that we can't control, trying to go it alone, right? So we want to make sure that we're utilizing our networks and utilizing our teams to understand the ambiguity a little bit better, to respond appropriately to the ambiguity that we're dealing with, and cut ourselves a little bit of slack, knowing that, okay, we have to be able to make decisions. We have to be able to take actions that may not turn out the right way, right? And we may face some outcome bias, all right? Given what we knew at the time, we made a decision, it didn't turn out great. Our process of making the decision and the deliberation that we made may have been very sound, but we start looking at the fact that it didn't turn out the way we wanted to, and therefore I'm going to be a little bit more stressed. I'm going to change the way that I made a decision, when we really just need to separate the outcome from the process of dealing with ambiguity. But also it's understanding, you know, that relationship with us. I've known plenty of actuaries who thrive in ambiguity. They're like, oh, I just want to get into the chaos and try and make sense of it. And others are a little bit more hesitant and like, okay, I really like the known. I want to have good data and make good decisions. So recognizing where you fall in your relationship with ambiguity and the ambiguity that you may be creating for others. Each of us has a responsibility to try and minimize how much ambiguity we're putting out there as well. So I think that will also impact our own sustainability, our own careers, if we can make it easier for those around us to deal with ambiguity as well.
Excellent. Yeah, great discussion here, Ari. I know you get much deeper in your video series. So I'd encourage people to be on the lookout for that. And thanks for joining us. Always great talking to you and listening to you on you know, your LinkedIn post, and your book is great. So thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks a lot for everyone joining us for another episode of Professional Development Edge podcast. And be sure to check out the great content offered by the SOA.
The views and opinions expressed in Society of Actuaries podcasts are those of the speakers or authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers or the SOA. The opinions expressed should not be construed as legal or professional advice and are provided for educational purposes only. Please see the terms of use on SOA.org for more information.